Welcome you all to the new video of international trade for the third semester of MA Economics program. We have in total 5 modules in this paper of international trade. The first module is international trade and economic development. Our first topic is the importance of trade to development. As we all aware that trade is an important contributor for the development of an economy. This is an income generating sector. This is an employment generating sector. So trade is considered as an engine of growth. It is pulling the development of a nation forward. I'm splitting this topic into three. First one is trade theory and economic development. Second one is trade as an engine of growth. Third one is contributions of trade to the development of nations. This is done in line with Dominic Salvator, who did in his book International Economics, Trade and Finance. In this module we are dealing with the first one, that is trade theory and economic development. We will look into the nature of trade theory and how does it deal with the economic development, how does it address the question of trade and economic development. Many nations in the world are in fact developing nations or less developed nations. Only a very few nations are developed in the world. For example, United States is a developed economy. They are in fact the largest economy in the world and they have high GDP per capita as well. And there are certain other nations like that Germany, France, Spain and Italy are developed and they have a high GDP per capita as well. So they are the major advanced economies in the world. But there are certain other nations which are developed, but those economies are not significant economies, as they are not big as the nations like Germany and France. For example, Singapore is a developed economy. Sweden is a developed economy. Denmark is a developed economy, but they have low GDP per capita. In fact, so they are not the major economy but developed economy. But there are certain other nations like India which are major economy but not developed economy. Like Russia is a kind of that. Brazil is a kind of that. So developing economies are growing economies but not like the capital intensive economies which are advanced economies. The nations I am telling that many nations in the world at present are developing economies or emerging economies or less developed economies and rather than developed economies. Why I am talking about that is many developing nations are exporting and specializing in the production of the primary products or agricultural products that are highly labor intensive, since less developed nations are mostly labor abundant nations. At the same time, capital intensive nations which are mostly advanced economies will focus on the production and export of the manufactured products. The core of this presentation is trade theory and economic development. We know the trade theory. Trade theory is the theory on the theory explaining how does the nation gain from trade and why does the nation engage in trade and how does the trade happen between two nations on certain commodities. This is the core of the trade theory, and the trade theory is that may be traditional trade theory, modern trade theory. Comparative advantage theory is a classical theory. It is in fact the traditional trade theory. HO theory is the modern theory. So all trade theories focus on the basis of trade. That means all those trade theories explain how does the nation gain from trade, what is the basis of trade, and why does the nation engage in trade. Anyhow, developing nations as labor abundant nations will focus on the production and export of primary commodities or agricultural commodities, since those sectors are highly labor intensive industries or sectors. At the same time, developed nations are capital rich nations. They are focusing on the production and export of manufactured products that are highly capital intensive. So in brief, traditional trade theory states that developing nations are mostly labor abundant nations, and so they will focus on the production and export of agriculture and related activities. At the same time, developed nations are capital rich nations, and they will capitalize the capital intensive sectors like manufacturing sector, industrial sector. So they will rely mostly on industries. At the same time, developing nations rely on agriculture that are labor intensive. Then what is wrong with the traditional trade theory? Is there any flaw involved in the traditional trade theory? Traditional trade theory, or mostly the trade theory commonly known as the trade theory is arguably static in nature. Trade theory is static theory, and it is arguably not relevant for explaining the development of nations which are involved in international trade. Is that really a static theory? Is traditional trade theory a static one? We have to address that issue. Traditional trade theory is in fact a static theory. Why it is called static theory? It is called the static theory as it is explaining the trade relations of the nations on the basis of the existing conditions. It is not considering the changes that may be possible for happen in the nation's economic conditions, and for example, there may be the possibility for a labor intensive nation to become a capital intensive nation. There may be a possibility for capital short nation to become a capital rich nation. So there are possibilities for the nations which are involved in international trade to become developed nations. So poor nation can become developed nations. Though this possible change has not been considered by the traditional trade theory. This is a serious flaw of the trade theory. Why this has happened? This has happened due to the static nature of the theory. This is static theory, as it is important to validate the theory. Otherwise, the basics will change. So in order to save the basics, this is the underlying assumption of the theory. This is static. This is inevitably static in nature. So as this is static in nature, it may not be able to explain the long-term changes in trade. It is just able to explain the short-term changes in trade, and it cannot be applied for a long period of time. In the long period, the nations may become different nations. Poor nation may become developed nations. So in the long run, there are possibilities for some nations involved in international trade to become developed nations. For example, South Korea is an ideal example for that. South Korea has become almost a developed nation for the time being. They are a model to the developing world, and they have gained a lot from international trade. And Taiwan is another nation which gained much from international trade. Mexico and Brazil are also the other emerging economies, developing economies, which gained much from the international trade sector. So this possibility has not been considered by the trade theory, and I'm requesting you to go through the changes, transitions happened in the international trade and economic development of certain nations, especially India. You just go through the trade statistics of India for the past 5 or 6 decades. Then you have to collect the data of export and import. What kind of products are being exported by India? What kinds of products are being highly imported by India? Then just make a comparison of that. The data will be available from the Commerce Ministry's website for the past few decades. Then go to the website. I will give you the link online. So this is about the today's presentation. This is about the trade theory and economic development. Then I was attempting to explain how does the trade theory, how does the traditional trade theory explain the economic development of the nations involved in international trade. And there are some serious flaws in that, and even though there are some serious flaws, trade theory cannot be neglected, because trade theory is stating, is examining, is giving you an idea about the basis of trade. It is giving us a basis of trade, and it is explaining how does the nations gain from trade, how does the gainful trade happen. So this is all about the today's presentation, and in the next video we will talk about the trade as an engine of growth. Thank you.